In this episode of the BFR Better for Results podcast, we sit down and talk with Jeremy Loenneke, associate professor at Ole Miss, who is a world-renowned expert in exercise physiology and blood flow restriction training. His research focuses on understanding the differences between muscle size and muscle strength and the impact of blood flow restriction training on relevant musculoskeletal adaptations, and so much more. Our conversation dives deep into how much training volume we actually need in order to maximize muscle adaptations, along with deconstructing how muscle size and muscle strength could be different adaptation processes. In addition, we spend some time diving into blood flow restriction training and getting nerdy on its application. I hope you enjoy the episode.
What's up, everyone? This is Nicholas Rolnick, the human performance mechanic, coming at you with the BFR Better for Results podcast. And today I am extremely excited to be talking with Dr. Jeremy Loenneke of Ole Miss. He is somebody who, honestly, almost started my journey in BFR, blood flow restriction, but has done so much work in other areas in terms of helping us improve our understanding of exercise. So in the spirit of BFR being better for results, we're of course going to talk about blood flow restriction, but we're also going to talk about the debate on volume and strength training. How much do we actually need in order to elicit positive benefit? I think there is significant barriers that exist for people to exercise, and being able to kind of dispel some of those myths to get people moving is something that really drives me and helps me fulfill my mission of getting people back to the activities that they love as quickly as possible. So with that, welcome, Dr. Loenneke. Thank you so much for volunteering your time. Do you want to tell the audience briefly who you are, what drives you, and then we'll kind of get started?
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for having me on. I'm currently at Ole Miss. I guess this is year 10 that I've been here, so I've been here a long time. I started out in athletics when I was younger, got involved with exercise through wrestling, transitioned to kind of bodybuilding, powerlifting, which is how I kind of fell into some of the early stuff on blood flow restriction. Did my undergrad and master's at Southeast Missouri State University. Did an internship doing some animal research at the University of Illinois with Dr. Kim Huey. Then went to the prestigious University of Oklahoma, Boomer Sooner, for my PhD. And then like I said, I've been here for 10 years. Very muscle-centric, resistance training-centric, focused in our lab. We do a lot of blood flow restriction. It's not the only thing we do, but is a big focus. And then we go wherever kind of the data takes us.
So how did you get interested in muscle physiology?
Yeah, as I said, I was a wrestler for most of my life, from the age of 5 all the way to, I guess, through high school. And I was always, I was an average wrestler. I was a very frustrating wrestler because I would beat people I shouldn't beat and then lose to people I shouldn't lose to.
The worst kind.
Yeah. I started off wrestling 112 and then I finished at 215. So
what?
Yeah. So basically, my coach, I always had pretty good technique. My coaches were always like, if you could just get into the gym and start training, and builds up a little bit as you're developing, you would set yourself up and you'd be a better wrestler. I honestly hated lifting weights. I hated training. And I would always tell my coaches, I'm like, Coach, I don't need to do any of that. I'm already too strong, But then I guess after my sophomore year or junior, or I guess in my junior year, I started lifting weights. And one of my buddies at the time was like, that was when, Flex Magazine and muscular development were still a thing. They might still be a thing, but they were really a thing at that point. And he was kind of into the bodybuilding world. So I just started kind of going to the gym to train with him and kind of got into that. So I kind of transitioned to trying to figure out how do I get as big as possible. And that led me to bodybuilding.com, message boards back in the day. It's where I met Lane Norton and kind of that whole community. Went to Illinois where he was at the time. Uh, but then just kind of really got into how do I get as big as possible? And then kind of shifted towards keeping that, but also how do I get strong? And then added blood flow restriction into that mix as well. So it started off with trying to get a little bit better for wrestling, and then just kind of took it one step at a time, and here I am.
So where I guess, I'm assuming you probably have a similar story as to how you found out about blood flow restriction, but you mentioned it. How did that kind of come on your radar?
Yeah. So towards the end of my undergrad, so this is probably 2006, 2007, around 2007, I started really trying to get into reading the research. Just any research, not blood flow restriction, just trying to get a better understanding of things. I started taking school much more serious at this time, because originally I wanted to work with athletes, and I thought, that's kind of what I want to do. And then I did a practicum where I was doing that. I was working with a guy named Ryan Kleppel, good friend of mine to this day, and following him along, watching kind of what he was doing, and I was like, this isn't for me. It took me a while to become honest with myself, but once I was like, I'm not interested in this. And we got to talking one day, and I remember saying something about research. I go, would you need like how do you go do something like research? He's like, well, you'll need a PhD for that. I'm like, well, I guess I'll just do that. So I was just kind of reading kind of the literature, and one of the papers I read was on blood flow restriction. So, but being an undergrad, I'm like, I must just not be understanding what I'm reading. This doesn't make any sense that you would cut off blood flow and that something good would happen. So I went to Illinois for my internship in the spring of 2008. And up there in the gym that I was training at, Lane Norton, a couple other guys, Chris Foz, they were kind of talking about this blood flow restriction thing. And they were actually using some knee wraps and things like that at the time. And I'm like, man, I guess I was reading that correctly. So then I just started reading everything that I could about it. And then part of my internship was having to do like a project. So I did it on blood flow restriction, just kind of like put a presentation together. And my undergraduate mentor was like, I think you might be onto something with this blood flow restriction thing, this practical. You should maybe look into this a little bit more. You should write a paper. And I'm like, okay. And then on the way home, I'm driving. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Write a paper. Like write a paper. And that was the one that we wrote for the Strength and Conditioning Journal. So that's kind of how I came across it. Just
Is that
reading broadly.
The practical BFR one?
Yep.
That was the paper that I came across, and I was just like, yeah, like this kind of could make sense. And then I kind of like disregarded it in my like little travels. And then me being a bodybuilder, and like you said, anything for just increasing muscle size, I was like, okay, like this might be something, and put it away. And then when I was competing in bodybuilding, I was getting my master's, and I saw somebody with wraps around their arms. Their arm was like purple. And I was just like, what is that? And then it's like, it's occlusion training. And I was like, all right, well, what does that do? He goes, well, you get a sick pump and then you get bigger muscles. And that was sold.
Yeah.
And then I tried to do it for like 2 weeks. It was agony. And it was also awful to set up, like really difficult in the upper body. And then I threw it away basically. And then I picked it up in PT school, like in my end of my first year, middle of my second, or beginning of my second. And then I was like, wow, like with a better understanding of exercise, I was like, there's something here. I don't necessarily know exactly what's going on or what it is, but it does kind of make sense. And then we started to see this literature that's pouring out on load. The absolute load doesn't necessarily, or the relative load doesn't necessarily matter as long as you're reaching some level of fatigue. And then all of a sudden, it started to click, at least for me. Did you encounter in your travels, in your experience, trolls on with your interest in BFR and trolling?
Oh yeah. Yeah, a lot, especially early on when I was presenting at some of the camps for Lane Norton. He used to do these VIP camps back in the day. And when you would promote that oh, I'm going to be talking about blood flow restriction training, like the comments that I would receive would be you know uh pretty crazy, and I get being skeptical. I think that that's an important quality. But yeah, lots of trolls, lots of, well, as you might imagine, where could I put this to make something else bigger, or where can I put it around my neck to make my brain bigger? It's like
The perennial fifth cuff.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Unbelievable. Yeah, I think, I guess, what in your experience, what do you think that those trolling you, is that ignorance? Is that just, a kind of appeal to what we currently know? Is there a lack of like intellectual curiosity? Like, what do you attribute those trolls to? Because I felt that too, especially in the beginning in 2016, 2017, posting on Instagram, the amount of trolls that I would get just by posting research articles and being like, hey, this is what this article said. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's several things. I think one, you get people who just like to piss other people off. I think they that's their thing, which is, it is what it is. I think you got other people who just assume that everybody else is stupid. So it's like this is idiotic, or I think the other part of that that's mixed into this is there's a lot of bizarre things in our field. So I think a lot of times people are kind of just really sensitive to that and being like, okay, now what are you guys doing now? You're cutting off blood flow in your training. Can you just lift weights and just do the basic principles? So I kind of get that angle a little bit where you're like, wait, what are you doing? So I think it's a mixture of a lot of things. And I think you have some people who just like to, poke the bear.
So
Um,
you mentioned bizarre things in our field. Let's let's just hit on a couple of the bizarre things that we observe in the field of exercise science.
well, yeah, I think you have all sorts of things where you have people doing, maybe they're um, walking backwards on a treadmill, or they're some sort of diet, or they're taking some sort of supplement, or they're taking, I don't know, a variety of things
Full
where
body electrical suits.
yeah. So, or like, the wearing, you know, um, wearing a mask, making it very hard to breathe, convincing yourself that you're training at altitude. So there again, there might be reasons why you might want to do that. There could be specific reasons, but mimicking altitude, I don't think is one of them. That's, I mean, you do look pretty awesome. I must admit. I think it looks pretty pretty intense when you're training, look like Bane lifting weights. Um, but yeah, I think there's
Jazzerciser.
yeah. So lots of things.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think what reading your work, and I I always appreciate when you've gone on other podcasts and your humbleness and your skepticism is something to be admired for people that are in the position that you're in. So kudos to you. I think having a healthy dose of skepticism is always a good thing. And with that being said, I kind of want to transition to before we return back to some BFR and getting nerdy there, is volume and strength training. And how much do we really need to do? Because in our society, at least in the United States, 70% of individuals are overweight or obese. And I was actually literally this morning, I was in a conversation with a client, and I was talking about the amount of people that actually meet the physical activity guidelines. And it was something like 46% of America meets no aerobic or resistance training guidelines whatsoever. And then a subset, it's almost like if I'm remembering it correctly, it's like 9% don't like me, or 9% meet resistance training guidelines. And I think from my understanding of the state of fitness is that there is so much tribalism that happens where you have people that are very high volume, so you have to do a lot of exercise in order to maximize muscle growth. And then you have the very ultra low volume camp where you want to do the minimum effect, what we call the minimum effective dose. So I guess based on your interests, what can we learn about volume? And secondarily, the relationship between muscle size, so hypertrophy, and muscle strength.
Sure. Yeah, I think many roads lead to growth. I think there are much fewer that lead to strength, right? So I think that one of the things that you said is kind of this tribalism. So, I think whatever you need to tell yourself to stay motivated to train for as long as you can, roll with that. I think your concern and my concern is when you start telling people this is the way, not a way. So I think that what is the relationship between volume and growth? I think that that's a tricky one. I think if we think about sets to failure, obviously one set to failure is better than no sets, right? So is two better than one? Probably. Is anything beyond 3 or 4 sets, it probably becomes very, very, very difficult to detect, right? And then you have to think about, well, what are the exercises that we're doing? Is it a single joint? Is it like a bicep curl, knee extension? Is it a squat? Are those different? Probably. Because once you start, becoming like a barbell squat, there's a lot more muscles involved. So which one is actually failing versus like a leg extension? So yeah, I agree that some degree of volume is important for muscle growth. I think that you have to activate the fibers for a sufficient duration of time. The next question is, what is sufficient duration of time? I don't know. Theoretically, if you do an MVC, so you contract as hard as you can, theoretically, you've activated a large portion of your muscle, but that does not typically stimulate large amounts of growth. So that tells you that activating the fibers is in and of itself not enough. Like there needs to be a duration component. Now, how long does that need to be? I don't think extremely long. I always like to do 3 to 4 sets to failure or close to failure is probably good enough. If you need to do more because you mentally need that to stay motivated, then by all means do that. At the same time, I think you have people who are going, well, for strength, you also need volume, or you have people who are just chasing volume as a proxy for growth or a proxy for adaptation. And I think that that's kind of problematic. And I think you mentioned a paper by Dr. Buckner that I've not read that, but I think I'm familiar generally with the idea of because you're increasing volume over time doesn't mean that will then result in better growth, right? Something's happening because you're able to do more volume, but that doesn't necessarily equate to growth, right? Because there are many times where you can do more volume, but growth doesn't occur. So I think that there's a lot of people doing a lot of wasted sets. Wasted sets meaning it's not doing anything for adaptation. But again, I'm on board with people because the points that you said earlier, there are some people who I know, and if you would have told me this back in the day too, I was doing way too much exercise for adaptation, but I didn't care, right? I don't care. Like I'm just in here. I want to train as hard as I can today. I don't care that the last 6 sets I did aren't really contributing to growth. It wasn't I wanted to feel really just exhausted when I left. So you could argue that that wasn't the most optimal way, but it kept me motivated to train for a long time. So I think you have to have a little bit of nuance in these discussions. Now, with respect to strength, I think strength comes from lifting heavy weights. And somehow this has become controversial, and I don't even know how. I really don't. Um, I'm not saying that lifting light weights, even to failure, I'm not saying that that doesn't stimulate strength in some studies. But it doesn't stimulate the same amount of strength as lifting heavy weights. It just doesn't. And the reason why people have such a hard time with this is because they think that a change in size must equate to a change in strength. Not only it has to. That's what some people's view are. So the fact is that it doesn't have to do anything. We know that a variety of loads stimulate growth, but high loads are going to optimize strength. And the data to me seems extremely clear on that. Even with blood flow restriction, we just finished a study last year where low intensity exercise didn't really even change relative to a non-exercise control. When you added BFR, it did. When you were doing max contractions, it was the highest, right? So to me, that makes complete sense though. That lifting heavy weights is going to be better for strength because it's more of a performance-like task.
Yeah, I think what we need to do in an effort to demystify is we need to go and we need to talk about the different factors that could possibly contribute to an increase in strength. We first, though, before we even do that, need to define strength. So what specifically is strength in your operating definition of the word?
Yeah, my operating is just what people think of when they think of strength, right? So the most that you can lift one time, all right? And I think that that's a traditional definition of strength. So I think people have changed it now to where to try and mold this story a little bit, where it's like, well, strength is more like what I'm thinking about. Strength is like like a 30 RM. Nobody ever thinks of strength like that. No one. So when I think of strength, I'm talking about maximal strength you can do one time, which is how most people on the planet define strength.
So if I'm on board, okay, if I would say strength is your maximal expression of force, agree or disagree in a particular movement, in a particular type of contraction?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay. So the thing with, I guess, that there's some disconnect is people are not really aware of the nuances associated with the specificity of strength versus the relative non-specificity of muscle growth, aka hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So I think that it's important when we start to break down the topic that we talk about the different ways in which strength or the expression of force is different in terms of the adaptation profile of muscle growth. So could you talk about a couple of the different, like the differences between those types of adaptations?
Yeah. So and I think what you said makes a lot of sense too, where it's like, because it really hinders the conversation on both sides. Because when you have people coming out like me and you saying, hey, there's a lot of different ways to make a muscle grow, right? You can do low loads, you can do high loads, you can do some aerobic exercise, even though it's not going to be to the same extent. But all of those are going to lead to growth. And people's first thought is, well, I know that lifting heavy weights produces way better strength than lifting low loads, so that can't possibly be true, right? But as you're saying, that they are different things. So when we think about muscle growth, we're thinking about adding protein, right? So there's more protein there, more theoretically, we would think of it probably being contractile. Now, why that doesn't contribute to force is a whole nother discussion. But we think about adding more protein than was there before. So The fact that you can get there many different ways tells you, as you said, it's a non-specific kind of adaptation. And you can get it with aerobic exercise, but not usually to the same level as you would with resistance exercise, but it can happen. Whereas strength has that huge specificity component, which would probably maybe be some neurological. I think that makes sense to say neurological, but then I would have to be assuming that I know exactly why people get stronger. I don't know that. I think the neural mechanism makes a lot of sense. But the strength, if we look at kind of all the parameters that happen when someone gets stronger. So if high loads are better than low loads, well, then what does that tell us? That there's a specificity component, right? And I think that's one of the things that most people agree on. Now the question is, what explains that specificity component? Probably neurological, but I mean, it could be some other factors, I suppose.
So one of the things you kind of touched upon, like I think of in the neurological, I think the most relevant type of adaptation following high intensity strength training, and by high intensity I just mean using heavy loads, not necessarily like high intensity in some people just means training to volitional fatigue.
Sure.
I'm specifically talking about high load training, is that there is this difference in muscle fiber recruitment patterns. And so when we have that difference, that also creates this amount of specificity in the task, correct? So if we think that, then naturally there's going to be a divergence in the expression of that force, because we're now training to the task. And I think you have really your work on training for the task, or the idea that, you know, we kind of obfuscate the magnitude of strength differences when we retest 1 rep maxes in the middle of the investigation to almost like recalibrate loads. So I guess one of the ways in which you're referring to, I'm assuming, and please feel free to clarify, that when you're talking about neural adaptations, you're talking about the ability of for us to instantaneously recruit those what we call high threshold motor units that are the ones that are going to be able to produce enough force.
Yeah, that could be one of the things, right? So if we think about the levels of signal, you could send more signal, or you could have less inhibition in the spinal cord, or you can lower thresholds at the motor neuron, which would, as you said, makes it easier to fire. And one of the things that you said too is that I think is confusing for people. It's confusing for me. I mean, if you do low loads to failure, or if you do low loads with blood flow restriction to failure, you will activate the across the whole spectrum. But the neural strategy is different. So when you first start lifting a light weight, you don't need to activate the whole muscle to move the weight. By the end of it, you may have activated the whole muscle, and that's maybe why we see such robust growth. But to move a heavy weight one time, you have to activate a huge portion of that muscle, or the weight doesn't move. So although you get maximal recruitment, the strategy that the body uses is completely different in my mind.
So yeah, so so you mentioned the difference between something like a firing frequency in terms of the impulses in the from the central nervous system all the way to the motor unit. You also talked about like rate cycling, right? So basically that's the principle that you're only activating certain amount of muscle fibers, and then they turn off and then they come through, and that's where you're going to see the robust growth in low load strength training versus something like heavy load strength training, where your recruitment pattern, so the specificity of the adaptation, is such that you get more efficient at being able to engage those muscle fibers all instantaneously, because as you said, the weight's not going to move, right?
Yeah. And I think a follow-up to that is that some people, and maybe in physical therapy, their next question would be is, do you need to, how strong do you need to get to make activities of daily living easier?
100,000% is something I think about way too often.
And I think that's an important question. So, and it gets to your point, like, who are we talking to? So if all you're talking about is maximal strength, then yeah, you need to lift with high loads, right? Or at least spend some time doing that. But if it's just to get strong enough to make your life easier, I don't know that you need to be the strongest person on the planet for that. So I think that's an important caveat that should be included for sure.
And so we talked about the neural strategies. So we talked about the firing frequency. So how we're able to fire more or quicker impulses. We also talked about the difference in terms of rate cycling. So it should make sense that when you're training low intensities, you will increase your strength because there is some sort of neural component. But if you're comparing it to a task where the specificity of that training is geared toward the specificity of the assessment, which would be the 1 rep max or whatever you're doing, well then yeah, the recruitment patterns are probably going to matter, right? So then there's other things too that people kind of forget where these could play a role. It could also be the fact that, hey, when we're doing a big multi-joint movement, we might have less co-activation, meaning the quads might be equally as active or slightly more active than the hamstrings. So now the torque that's produced at the knee joint is less. We get stronger or we do a task more, our body becomes more efficient, and now we have less hamstring co-activation. So for the same relative force, or same absolute force that the quad is generating, it's now creating more knee torque because now we have less hamstring activation to antagonize it. So there's so many different ways that when we talk about strength, it could be different than the adaptations of muscle growth, right? Is that kind of...
Yeah, well, I mean, you know my stance. I await evidence that muscle growth is important for strength.
So like, I guess for here, this kind of goes into my nerd brain. What do we know about costomeres and their potential role in optimizing force transmission at the, at the muscle fiber level?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there's
Well, what are costomeres first and foremost for the listener or viewer, like in your thoughts and
I
ideas?
mean, I'm not even familiar with that literature, to be honest.
Okay, well then,
I know,
yeah, I mean,
so, but like when you think about like what's going on at the fiber level, right? How you transmit force, right? So the thing that needs to be kept in mind though is if you look at like force transmission at a fiber level versus the force transmission when that fiber is in the human body, it's completely different. And that's not to say that studying the fibers is not useful or studying what's going on locally is not useful. It's just giving you other information. So for me, I've always wanted to discuss what's going on in the human body. Like when you have that fiber in that person, can they move better, or are they better off, or are they not better off? It doesn't, to me, it's irrelevant what's going on at the fiber level if they actually can't take advantage of it. Not that it's irrelevant, but I mean you get the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people going, well, when we look at the fiber level, this should tell us something about what's going on in the whole body. It's like it could, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that if I take this and I put it back in the person, which is not what happens, but let's say we did, we're not all of a sudden, if my fiber level got stronger, but if I'm not stronger, moving voluntarily.
Yeah, then it's like what's the difference? And that I don't really want to touch on this that much, but it almost reminded me of this whole debate now that, so there's two different massive schisms that are happening in exercise science right now. One is the volume debate, right? How much do we need? And I want to circle back before we then go into the BFR stuff, which is the really fun stuff for me. Definitely picking your brain here. But the second is this lengthened partial debate. And I guess I'm wondering kind of what your thoughts are in terms of is muscle growth going to be maximized in all cases, which is what a lot of fitness influencers and even some scientists are trending towards, saying that if we have a muscle that is in a stretched position and we recruit or we try to do a joint action that would signal that that muscle is recruited, that's going to elicit better growth than if we were doing something like a middle of the range motion or full range of motion.
Yeah. My students are really into this idea. I'm not really into it myself. I think the concerns are always, I guess for me, it's hard for me to imagine that if you were to take differing things close to failure, that there would be big differences between them. That's hard for me to imagine. I think some people suggest that what you're saying is that there are certain range of motions that are better off than others. But I think when you set up studies like that, you have to make some concessions on how close you are or away from failure when you're comparing those tasks. So I don't really know. I personally think that just train. If you want to mix in some of the other things.
Jeremy, that's not sexy to put on Instagram. Just train, just go through a full range of motion, work very close, if not to failure. That's not going to get you clicks. That's not going to get you views.
Well, here's what I'll say too is, I'm always similar to our conversation that we had earlier. I'm always trying to be very careful about when someone's coming out with some new idea, even if it's like a rehash of an old idea, and then just immediately poo-pooing on it and going, I don't think so, because I remember those days. So for me, I remain skeptical based on what I've seen, right? And to be fair, I haven't thought about it probably as much as you, as probably as much as my students, or it's not something I'm interested in. But it's hard for me to imagine that there would be big differences, but I remain cautiously optimistic, or cautiously skeptical might be a better term.
Yeah, I mean, I think it brings up a lot of questions for me with the lengthened partial, because, and I don't want to, again, harp on this too much because this is a podcast in and of itself, but if a muscle is going to so the whole idea of a lengthened partial is that the muscle itself is going to undergo what's called stretch-mediated hypertrophy, which just means that at some point there is an increase in passive tension that is going to augment the mechanical tension that's going to lead to increased growth. But then my mind goes to, well, there's a couple of things. Number one, the muscle has to be activated in some way, shape, or form during that contraction to be able to experience that additional growth. Now, that may or may not be true, because we do have stretching studies where the muscle is not active and there is some growth, but that is a huge duration and high amounts of discomfort to be able to elicit that thing. So that's one. Number two, then you also have to say, all right, well, if we're thinking that that the muscle, the sarcomere, so the smallest contractile unit of the muscle fiber, that has to experience passive tension. So it has to go into the descending limb, right? At some, like, if Titan is going to be able to augment that mechanical tension, then there has to be an exposure of some sort to the descending limb. At least that's my understanding of that. So we need muscle biopsy studies to be able to see that. And then last, like the body, and this kind of goes back into activation, but if the muscle is there and our joint action is flexion to extension and we're activating what's called, what should be an extensor, well, then the muscle still has to have some degree of leverage in that position to be able to get recruited. So like these are all things that I mean, again, it's very interesting to talk about, but at the same time, I find it so like it's nerdy for us to talk about, but I don't find it relevant. Like it's so tough for me because I'm very much concerned with getting people moving. And I feel that the fitness industry is a huge culprit in creating complexity where there doesn't need to be complexity.
Yeah, I generally agree with that. They may argue that, well, we're not talking about it for those people. We're talking about it for people
So
who have maximized their growth and trying to add a little bit more, which might be a fair point. But yeah, I'm with you on how do we get people, and this is way outside of my area, but something I think a lot about, where how do we get people wanting to exercise? Because people don't want to do it. And this is something I always bring up in some of my classes I teach as well, where, and people will say, well, they're lazy. And my first thought is, okay, but what is it about them like that doesn't make it appealing, right? How could we make it? And, the answer can't be, well, they just got to strap up their bootlaces and get after it. Well, that doesn't work, obviously. So I don't know. I think, I don't know. There could be just something different about people who exercise versus people who don't. And maybe it's how they were exposed when they were really young. Do they have good experiences or bad experiences, or I don't know.
I think you hit on a really important topic, and it kind of spiraling out into another sub combo. But I like to think about it if you ever heard of the Proshka's stages of change model.
I don't think so.
So it's a health behavior model that has various different stages. There's a pre-contemplation phase, there's a contemplation phase, then there's an action phase, then there's a maintenance phase, and there may be some relapse or something other, last phase. But basically, I like to think about exactly what you just said in those terms because it helps me contextualize the potentially relevant interventions that we can as health, me as a health provider, being a physical therapist, but also as somebody who's generally interested in the promotion of exercise. And I circle back to this because the pre-contemplation phase, and to relate this to what you just said, which are there something that's different between exercisers and non-exercisers? Well, the pre-contemplation phase in Proshka's stage of change model basically means that you're doing something that is not desirable or is not what you want them to do, but they're unaware of what they're doing, right? So not exercising, they're unaware that exercise should be something that is really important. Fine. Then there's the contemplation phase. Contemplation phase is people are aware that exercise is good for them, but they're really not ready to make any sort of behavior change. And then there's the action phase. These are the people that are actively doing the activity that you want them to do, exercise, right? And then there's the maintenance phase where this is when they've been doing it for 6 months, right? And 6 months is kind of, in my mind, that critical cutoff because we tend to see in, for example, diet studies, right? Diet adherence after 6 months tends to plateau. It's like 85% or something like that of people end up regaining the lost weight. If that's a statistic that kind of fits in, maybe it's misquoted, I don't know, but a vast majority of people end up gaining weight or gaining more weight after that. So then going back to your point, and this is something that in the last 5 years, I've really begun to appreciate so much. And I think that this is the barrier that exists. It's that people associate exercise with looking good naked, right? There's just an aesthetic benefit to working out and nothing more. But what we're really finding out is exercise is the best non-pharmacological intervention you could do for your health. And if you combine modalities, it's even better. And so I think that from those individuals in the pre-contemplation phase, number one, we have to get them to the contemplation phase. We have to bring them and get awareness that exercise is really important, right? That takes different strategies than somebody like who's in the contemplation phase, who I would say most people know they should exercise, right? So they're just not doing it. But I think in order for us to get them to that action phase, what we need to do is we need to show them that in actuality, one strenuous exercise session creates, I think in one of the Instagram posts that I looked at, it was over 4,500 genes that it impacts. And chronic exercise can help with reducing morbidity and mortality and things that extend beyond just aesthetics. You and I are definitely ones where we pursued our love of muscle physiology from the fact that we just want to get bigger muscles. But I'm very passionate about this topic because the more I learn about muscle physiology, the more convinced I am that this is probably the biggest overall barrier, is this lack of connecting the aesthetics to the overall systemic health. And the fitness industry, which is why I wanted to talk to you about volume, is making it way more complex than I think it needs to be.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the utilities of just resistance training and being physically active, if nothing else, it helps you maintain what your baseline function is. So let's say you're in your 30s and you haven't done anything. We know that as you age, that's going to start to decline, right? If you stay physically active, you're going to slow that decline. You're probably still going to lose, but it's going to be slowed down. So the more you can maintain that health span over time, the better off you're going to be. And I think, we have data on this in younger people. We have data on this in older people, where if you exercise, you tend to be, I don't know, quote unquote, a little bit more robust. So you don't get hurt as easy. And that's typically when bad things start to happen, especially as you get older. You get hurt, you become inactive for a period of time, you lose a little bit of function. You may regain some of it, but not all of it. And then you're worse off than you were before that, fall or whatever, sickness, illness. So I think making yourself and just maintaining what you have, if nothing else, you don't have to be Mr. Olympia. And I think you're right. I think changing the perception of what people have to do. And I think that the idea of, we've put out into the ether that, you always have to be continually pushing the limits. And that's true if you want to be Mr. Olympia or you want to be a powerlifter, even though you're probably going to plateau, but you should be in your mind pushing it like there's no such thing as a plateau. Just keeping yourself motivated. But for the normal person, that's a turnoff. It's like, well, I don't want to invest that much time. I want to just kind of, maintain what I have. I'm not trying to just keep doing more and more and more every week. And I think that, we've talked about this before on social media, but it's like, I think that we need to be putting more emphasis on, getting people training and then just maintaining it. Just getting something you're comfortable with, maintaining. It doesn't matter if you're not increasing strength over time, just maintain what you have. And I think a lot of people would be better off. I mean, a lot of people are going to disagree with that, but that's okay.
Listen, I think having a healthy discourse and as you said, skepticism is really important to moving forward, to pushing the industry forward. And I'm always of the mindset, I want to challenge my own biases, not only in having conversations, but also in the research that I'm involved in the BFR space. But that's why I have people on this podcast that are going to have differing views than me, because I want to hear them out and I want to make my own determination based on the state of the literature, their interpretations, and obviously practical experience as well. So I guess we kind of covered a lot of this topic. I wanted to talk two things now because you already kind of mentioned them. And I do want to continually shine light on your work in the strength and conditioning space. And but before we do that, you mentioned maintenance. And you mentioned like before, 3 to 4 sets to fatigue per muscle group a couple of times a week. Is that kind of your for the everyday person that's just looking to be physically fit, right? Resistance training wise, I'm bag the aerobic. For resistance training, what would you give in terms of a volume prescription based on your current understanding of the literature as a minimum effective dose that maximizes the potential physiological outcomes? So where does that kind of fit in?
Yeah, I would probably have them do, pick an exercise for a muscle group, and I'd probably just have them do total body a couple times per week, 2 to 3 sets, 2 or close to failure. If you're not feeling it that day, then, do a little bit less, but, something that's not going to take forever to do. You get in there and do a workout in maybe 25 minutes, and then go home. Most people could probably find some time to do that a couple times per week. And I think people would be better
Which
off.
is another byproduct of the higher volume crowd, because it gives an excuse for people to not exercise. Oh, if I can't do 5 to 6 sets per muscle group per workout, I'm clearly not going to gain the benefits.
Yeah. And I think, I know we're putting aerobic aside, but, just building in some physical activity in your daily life, getting some steps in, or, playing some intramurals, or playing, sports with your friends. Anytime I played basketball with the lab, we don't do it very often, but I'm exhausted for days, playing like 45 minutes or an hour worth of basketball. So it's like, if that's something that you could build in that people like to play basketball or whatever, just to be moving, getting some movement in, physical activity, I think would be great. With the weights, I think, I don't think you need to be doing a lot, but I think that there's probably something for maintaining your health span by doing it a couple times per week.
Yeah, and then I just kind of want you to touch upon, because you've been involved in a lot of different areas with exercise science, but definitely want to talk about, because you mentioned it before, about this plateau effect in terms of muscle growth. And I kind of just want to familiarize the listeners on why we may experience a plateau in muscle growth, and why, for optimizing health, that we may want to start earlier in our life resistance exercise training instead of later. However, even if you do start out later, there's still plenty of positive physical benefits and mental benefits to exercising.
Yeah. I think, this is something I've been interested in for a long time. It's like you start lifting weights, you increase muscle size, and at some point you're lifting weights, but your gains that are visually apparent to you kind of start to slow down, if not disappear completely, right? And I think people have started looking at that and going, well, that's because your program's not optimal. And it's like, I don't know if that's true. I think that, hitting a plateau in muscle growth is a pretty normal thing. It could be because your training is messed up. That's possible, but I think in most cases that's probably not the case. Now, one of the things that we have to talk about is the limitations of the literature, right? We don't have a lot of studies that are 2, 3, 4 years long, but I think you can just look around people who are honestly assessing themselves, right? I've lifted weights for a long time, right? And you could argue that I haven't been as serious about it in the last few years. That's true. But there came a point where I was getting stronger to a point, but I wasn't really changing my muscle size really at all. or nothing, visually apparent. And I was kind of curious as to, well, why is that? And then if you look at the literature, a lot of times what you'll see is large changes early on, and then it starts to dissipate. So it's not to say that you couldn't squeeze out a little bit more over time, or that some of these people aren't increasing muscle size, but it's probably a fraction of what they would see in that first, 3 to 6 months of training, right? And I think part of what's confusing for people is it sounds like me and you started lifting weights when we were very young, right? So I think when we first started, like, I gained muscle growth for a long time. Yeah, but you were also lifting weights during development, right? So you were already growing. So I think that might be very different than when someone who's 25, never lifted weights before, starts lifting weights. So yeah, we wrote a paper, Rio Kataoka did a nice job on that, trying to explain why is there a plateau physiologically? And the short answer is we don't know. There could be some mechanisms at the cell level that regulate how big it can actually get. And this kind of shuts everything down. Maybe you have a limitation how many mononuclei that you can add. Maybe you have a limitation on just the ability to regulate the system up to where you just keep getting bigger. And I think physiologically it would make sense that you wouldn't just infinitely increase. I don't know. We don't really do that with anything else. It's hard to imagine why muscle growth would be that much different. So, but I think that, with the other thing that we've talked about is maybe starting really, really young. So if you have this baseline that we talked about is trying to maintain, right? If you start lifting weights when you're 25, maybe you can shift that baseline up a little bit, but maybe not too much, right? I mean, once you're a full-grown adult, you can change your physiology, but it's not very easy to do that. If you're a kid, right, maybe you can shift it up way higher than you would be if you were to do the same thing as an adult. Now, that's a lot of conjecture, right? But I think that there could be something during the developmental period, right, where maybe if they are active, maybe if they are training, if they are participating in sports, maybe their baseline that they're going to have as an adult will be higher than it ever would have been had they not done that as a kid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a fascinating topic because there is no infinite growth. And honestly, from just a systems perspective, it makes sense. Like, muscle is metabolically expensive. So why would we continue to experience unfettered growth if, from an evolutionary perspective, we want to try to be as lean as possible?
Yeah.
It's just something that's interesting because, a lot of people, as much as I would like to believe that I have gotten bigger or whatever, I probably look the same as I did a decade ago. I might have less body fat, or I might have slightly more body fat, but generally speaking, I probably look very similar. And I don't think that's appreciated enough because, again, it's not sexy. It's not like nobody wants to say, oh yeah, hey, we're going to do this workout and, you're going to gain, what in the resistance training studies, right? It's a 4 to 8%, something like that over a period of growth. So like that 4 to 8% in 6 to 12 weeks, that's not going to continue to happen for infinity.
The other part of that too is, which is kind of the fascinating point, is let's say that you are slowly increasing, right, over time. At some point, you start to have the age-related effects start to occur. So you start to have this competition, and what that looks like.
You kind of talked about in the paper where we have this concept, and I talk about this in with respect to BFR, which we'll pivot to right after this, is anabolic resistance.
Yeah.
And maybe, whereas muscle protein synthesis in this might be blunted in the trained state, but maybe muscle protein breakdown is less, or maybe there's just a relationship change between the two, where ultimately we want to be able to, if we're going to grow more, we have to elevate muscle proteins, at least specifically myofibular protein synthesis. And so I think that that's something that, again, is is relatively unexplored given the fact that it's very difficult to carry out these longitudinal strength training studies.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier is there needs to be some appreciation for, because a muscle grows doesn't mean that it's due to what we typically discuss in response to exercise. So a muscle might grow during development, right? And the muscle maintenance, that might be due to something completely different than the mTOR pathway, right? So we become very mTOR centric because we know that affecting that pathway affects your ability to respond to overload.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that it affects your ability to maintain muscle at baseline or the ability to develop and things like that. So there's lots of different ways to grow, but we typically are always discussing how do we make it grow via exercise, and that might be different mechanisms than what happens during development or other. Or they might be related, but they could be different. I think that's worth mentioning as well.
Yeah, I mean, we keep on pushing the BFR stuff back, but again, it's so interesting because I'm like the BFR guy that tells people to strength train heavy,
Yeah.
because of a number of reasons. But I also think back to this where we also, so there's the whole, and you talked about this in the paper as well. And for those interested, it's in sports medicine. It's, what is it called? Let me just see, just so you have it. The plateau and muscle growth with resistance training and exploration of possible mechanisms. You talked about this, where there is this disconnect between the acute hormonal response and the longitudinal growth that's observed. And there is this movement, which, to be fair, like I have a bias toward, where mechanical tension is the primary driver, and there's really almost nothing else that exists that can help explain the reasons why we get similar growth in low intensity, moderate intensity, and high intensity or heavy load strength training if we have this whole thing. And that's where the physiology comes in, the differences, and you kind of end up at the same area where, effort is going to drive recruitment, which is then going to be where, depending on your position on the force velocity curve, is going to increase muscle force, which is analogous to mechanical tension, etc. But what's interesting to me, and I was literally having this conversation on DMs with somebody like right before this, is we take anabolic steroids and you do nothing, like no exercise, and you can gain muscle mass. So I'm very much interested in why that may be the case if we're kind of unable to really make a determination between acute hormonal elevations and long-term growth. I don't know if you've actually looked into this or what your thoughts are, but I definitely want to cover this before we pivot to
I think it
BFR.
gets to, the different, it just works through a different way. So it's like the taking the anabolic steroids, you're changing your baseline to a tremendous extent. So like for the acute hormonal response, you get a little bit of a blip and it comes back down very quickly. But with steroids, I mean, you're increasing that baseline to a super physiological level, and you're keeping it there all day. So I think that could have, that's like an apples to oranges kind of comparison there for me. And I'm with you on the acute hormonal response. I buy into all of that discussion.
Well, you were on that paper. You were on that paper that when I reached out to you and you were like, yeah, we were sitting on this for like 7 years or something like that with the Laurentino paper on. I was like, oh, that fits my biases so well.
Yeah. And I think that's not to say that, when I first started learning about some of this literature, especially with the acute hormonal response, I remember thinking like, because it was Stu Phillips, he was presenting some of their work, and I'm like, I remember it was my first conference, and I remember sitting in the audience being like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Is this guy crazy? And I just remember being dumbfounded that, how could this be? I know people who take steroids. I know for a fact that these hormones work, but I was not understanding that the acute hormonal response is not the same thing as a chronic elevation in that hormone. And it's not, and I think that people will often hear what he says or hear what I say or hear what you say and go, oh, hormones aren't important. That's not what that's being said at all. If you were to take someone's testosterone and deplete it to zero, they would have an effect, right? We're talking about the acute change in that hormone. And I think that we just have to think about what is that comparison, because Stu's going to say, well, when you have that acute change, it doesn't really change your resting level. So it'll go up and come back down, and that's not enough to do anything.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating from a a nerdy perspective, but it again is a vehicle to increase the complexity of just working out, because now people are doing the whole high volume, low rest, maximize the hormonal response, like very strenuous type of workouts. And I just don't know if that's necessary given what we currently know about the role of acute hormone elevation and its ultimately longitudinal benefits on muscle growth. And it just really frustrates me that we have this health crisis in our country, and we have the solution. It's there. Exercise. And it's just like, and I guess this maybe is just the role of industry in general, which is we have to create this, this sense of meaning unfortunately, through complexity, where people are like, you have to do this, you have to do that. This is going to maximize it. And you know what? There are certain strategies I would say, yeah, this is probably going to maximize your results. But is that something that we need to tell the masses who are very hesitant to just get involved in exercise? I personally don't think so. And that's what frustrates me so much about this volume debate, where we're seeing that, as you mentioned earlier, one set to fatigue is going to elevate muscle protein synthesis 100%. And then as you go further and further and do more and more sets, there's diminishing returns. Yeah. But you're still getting a massive, massive spike that's going to help you. And for me, as somebody is interested in helping people, become the best versions of themselves, that's through exercise. And it really just frustrates me to no end, thinking about this stuff, because it's like you have the solution. It's like right here. And people are still dumbfounded and want to take medication, and all. It's so frustrating.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts for you on the volume, on anything that we discussed before we pivot to a little bit of BFR for like 15, 20 minutes?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. I think you're right. I think, at some point, all you're doing is delaying your recovery. And for some people, that might not matter, because maybe they're not going to train again that body part for another week. But if you're looking to maximize it, then maybe you should be doing the minimum that you need to do to maximize that threshold, which is probably a lot less than what you're currently doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating area, and I'm definitely looking forward. I have some high volume people coming on, so it's going to be good to hear some divergent perspectives. Well, yeah, so let's pivot to a little bit of BFR. That for people listening, Jeremy is one of, if not the most published author in the space on BFR. I have been, as I said, his paper on the practical restrictions in Journal of Strength and Conditioning was like the paper that I remember picking up and being like, wow, interesting. And kind of spurred my neurotic dive into all things blood flow restriction. And so Jeremy has been extensively published, has his hands in a lot of different areas in the BFR space. And in fact, Jeremy, to my knowledge, was really the first researcher to spearhead the use of personalized pressure during BFR application. Unless I'm wrong. I was trying to find, I found the 2013 paper that was kind of calling for a personalized pressure. But
Yeah, I think some of the Brazilian groups they had done some work on that. They had used the relative pressure. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that, we made a big push for it, and made it very vocal. Because for me, it was as simple as saying like, um, you know, if you were to go to a conference and someone were to say, "What load did you use?" and you say, "Oh, we used 10 pounds for everyone," you would be laughed out of the room. But if you more or less did the same thing with blood flow restriction, it was just another day at the office, and I was just puzzled by that. And so I think it's fair to say that but others as well, were really making a push to be like, hey, we should be making it relative somehow to this person. And we did write a lot about that for sure.
yeah, I think the the article that I also refer to is the elephant in the room. I think it was a letter to
Yeah.
the editor.
Marty Springer's paper.
Yeah, but you also had you had the relative arbitrary pressures and looking at that, and again, for those that are listening, just obviously I'm assuming about blood flow restriction, right? But personalizing the pressure just means that we're taking what's in essence your blood pressure with a specialized cuff, and we're exercising at a percentage of that. Now, this is, the first topic I definitely want to talk about is the potential relevancy of personalized pressure, because there is a contingency, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, that really is just like, hey, we can just use whatever pressure we want, and as long as we're exercising to volitional fatigue, it shouldn't matter. And so I kind of want to hear your thoughts from a researcher perspective. Why or why not should personalized pressures be used, and how important are they in the practical setting, but also in the research setting, and kind of if there is a divergent, opinion, why that is the case.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things where if you were to use just an arbitrary pressure, meaning that everybody gets the same pressure, are you probably going to see, and especially if you're going to failure, right? Are you still going to see benefits? Probably. Um, Assuming that you don't have people who are under complete arterial occlusion, right? So it's possible that if you apply a pressure high enough arbitrarily and one person gets it and it's super occlusive for them and they can do maybe 4 reps, then they probably aren't going to have the same adaptation, even if they are training to failure. But I think in general, I guess there's been plenty of studies that have used an arbitrary pressure that have seen some benefits. So in that sense, could you get away with it? Probably, unless you run into that situation that I just said. Now, from an adherence perspective, from a safety perspective, from an applying this in a medical situation, or a clinical situation, I think relative pressures are going to be important because we know that applying a higher pressure induces greater discomfort, right? We know that applying a higher pressure that affects the arterial flow into the limb, right? So if I do 30% of my 1RM with a high pressure, I'm going to have less blood flow going into the limb than if I am training with 40% or if I'm training free flow. So there is a physiological difference. The other thing that Marty Springer is also concerned about is the cardiovascular response is greater with a higher pressure. So from a safety perspective, I think that it probably makes sense to know what pressure it is that you're applying. And I think if you're ever going to make any headway, I'm not a clinician. I don't want to give anybody that impression. But my guess would be is if you're applying it to someone in a clinical setting, the more information that you can have to apply it as safe as possible is going to be the better. You're going to be better off. But of course, if I applied 100 millimeters of mercury, people trained to failure, depending on the cuff size, probably going to be fine. But the cardiovascular response might differ across people. So yeah, I still maintain that, having some idea of the pressure that you're applying is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit a lot of it on the head. I think what you didn't talk about, and I know you believe this, is the ability to compare relative responses between interventions.
Yeah.
If we don't know the relativized pressure and we're using an arbitrary pressure to apply it to that person, we don't necessarily know if there will be a divergent response or not. And so this is just another way that we can be able to standardize the application. Because what people should appreciate is, and we kind of hit on this indirectly, is that there exists a normal heterogeneity in study methodology in strength training studies, right? Just exists. The rest periods, the loads, the population, everything. But then with blood flow restriction, now we have another layer of potential heterogeneity that impacts the physiologic response to the application of BFR to the person. And so personalized pressures just allow us to know. And basically, and this is where I kind of want to ask you too, is there you mentioned it kind of, and to my knowledge, from the last that I looked at it, that the blood flow restriction responses is not directly linear in the sense of 50% AOP or arterial occlusion pressure is not 50% reduction in blood flow, but at least it gives us a relativized value that we can use in the study. So basically, in essence, personalized pressure is trying to reduce some of the heterogeneity that's now going to exist within the cuff application parameters of the methodology that's being used. So that to me is a huge, huge reason why personalized pressures, especially, and I'm a clinician, so I can say this, are really important in a clinical setting when we're dealing with individuals with comorbidities because of papers like the Marty Spranger's group and talking about the potentially heightened cardiovascular response and understanding the different comorbidities have on the exercise pressor reflex.
Yeah, and I think that, the other component of that is there could be certain adaptations that are preferably driven by higher pressures. So if you don't know the pressure that you're applying for that person, it's going to be hard to really target that's like, for example, changes in blood flow, vascular adaptations. We don't have a lot of good evidence for this, but there's some suggestion that maybe higher pressures might be better. So if you don't know what's a high pressure, then that's a problem.
So yeah, let's briefly segue into vascular adaptation. So why may that be something that we should care about?
Well, I think that from a health span perspective, if you can improve blood flow, maybe you can better maintain muscle over a period of time. So I think that's why most people that are listening to this podcast would probably care about it. But I think just having overall general blood flow is a good thing. I think the interest in it now is that some people view that as a potential moderator for the ability to change, to make a muscle grow. In other words, if you have greater baseline blood flow or a greater vascular network to begin with, maybe you can better deliver nutrients, and that can better utilize those nutrients to grow. So that's probably, the angle that I would take. But, other ones are from performance perspective, right? Increasing, vascularity, you're able to better get rid of byproducts and things like that, clear things from the muscle, and keep exercising for a given period of time. There's some suggestion that higher pressures might be important for that, but it's I wouldn't say that it's a done deal, but I have a hunch that there's something to there.
Yeah. Anything else so you mentioned vascular. Is there any other applications where where understanding the relativized pressure may be something that we need to consider?
Outside of safety, comparing across studies, uh, maybe certain adaptations. I mean, nothing's coming to my mind. But I think those are, the part that always bothers me is that when you get people who are like, well, it doesn't matter the pressure that you apply because you're still going to see this. It's like, no, it does matter because we know that differing pressures has a different impact. And I think to bring up the blood pressure thing one more time, I want to make sure that, and I know that's not what we're doing, but I want to make sure that, Marty Springer's whole argument is that there could be people who are very sensitive to metabolites and that we need to be cognizant of that. And I'm on board with that. I think both of us are. I think the part that maybe we took issue with is, you know, there's never a look at the magnitude of the change. And you're looking at these studies where it's like, this study augments blood pressure, this study augments blood pressure. It's like, yeah, of course, because you're comparing low load exercise to low load exercise with blood flow restriction. But the important question is, to what magnitude is that changing and how long does it stay elevated after you deflate the cuff? And both of those are, in my mind, not too alarming levels. It's usually less than high load exercise, and it comes back to baseline within 10 or 15 minutes. So I don't, for most people, if you have someone who maybe is hypersensitive to the metabolic reflex, maybe you use your clinical expertise and you do or do not use it. But to just make a blanket statement because blood pressure's to a greater response, yeah, but the magnitude of that is important, right? Is it increasing up to 300 millimeters of mercury? It's not. Okay, well, maybe that's something that should be discussed. And I think that's
And even that, like it goes back to, I'm sure you're familiar with the McDougall paper in 1985, where they had
yeah,
people do 5 rep max or 1 rep max, and basically peak systolic diastolic was like 480 over 350, some ridiculously high number where we're not even going half of that. And BFR, even though again we're comparing, we know that the blood pressure is going to increase set by set by set. So, for example, in where if I'm having somebody that's hypertensive, I'm going to monitor them, which is what you should be doing when you're working with individuals with comorbidities. Monitor blood pressure, monitor other signs and symptoms associated with ischemia and things like that. But you can also deflate during the rest period, right? It might reduce the magnitude of the overall stimulus, but those metabolite induced effects are going to dissipate, but they're not going to dissipate within 20, 30, the majority of them are not going to dissipate within 15, 20, 30 seconds. So you can now mitigate and you can kind of go through and apply BFR, get a little bit of that accelerated fatigue without creating that magnitude of stress for that person that may have comorbidities.
yeah. I guess the other point I would bring up is, okay, what are you going to do instead? They're just not going to do anything. Is that the solution, that they don't do any exercise? And maybe it is, I don't know. But I think it's worth comparing, like what's the normal exercise look like for someone like this? And I think we talked about this before, but it's like, if you're clear to do normal exercise, probably not in every situation. I probably need to be very careful making a blanket statement, but I think it's safe to say that in most cases, it's probably, if you can do normal exercise, probably could do low load BFR, assuming that you're applying it appropriately and, using your brain when you're applying it.
Remember, Jeremy, common sense is not so common.
Yeah, that's
Right.
true.
So yeah, I mean, I think now the last thing I want to talk about before we segue on is how important is a personalized pressure in somebody that's in a fitness setting that is healthy and is probably using weights that are greater than 20 to 30% of the 1 rep max when doing BFR. How important do you feel understanding what that pressure actually is?
Yeah, I think that's complicated. I would tend to try to get them to use a little bit lighter weight, because one of the things that we know is that once you start creeping the load up, at some point, for whatever reason, is it because you're interrupting blood flow with just the contraction intensity? I don't know. Um, at some point, you're probably not getting an advantage to blood flow restriction. The utility in my mind is using it with low loads. Now, practical restriction, which is one of the things that I'm interested in, is you don't really know really how it's hard to tightly regulate that pressure. Um, so how important is it for the normal person who's probably interested in just muscle growth? You probably have some wiggle room there. We know that, between 40%, 90% arterial occlusion pressure is probably going to give you a very similar response. So as long as you get it close to that, you're probably fine. You're probably going to be fine regardless, especially if you're training close to failure. So I think for most people, it's if you get close, assuming you're outwardly healthy, probably good enough. Because the reason why I say that is you start having people who are going, well, I have it on this arm, and I have it on this arm. It feels slightly different. Is that going to be a problem? It's like, it's probably fine. I wouldn't stress out about it. But I'd also say that, I have people who anytime I do one of these, I have people who go, remind me never to use blood flow restriction. It's not better. I'm like, I don't care if you use it or not. I'm not an advocate for it. I just study it. It's something I'm interested in. It makes me no difference whether you use it or you don't use it. I think it's a potentially valuable tool, especially in certain circumstances, and it might be a way to keep you interested and motivated to train. But if you don't want to do it, then you could also just not do it. And you don't have to send me a message. You could just not do it.
Yeah, I think again, there's the idea, and this is where I connect. I really take, I really think it's important that when I teach blood flow restriction, that it's framed within the lens of normal strength training, because I truly believe that what we do know is longitudinal growth tends to be the same when we're exercising with or without BFR to volitional fatigue, right? That's pretty, and the magnitude of growth tends to be very similar, even to heavy load strength training. So for me, my own bias is Occam's razor. If our body is meant to be super efficient, then there should be one predominant or a predominant pathway that is underlying this, with different mediators, kind of we talked about throughout the conversation, but different mediators that can impact the magnitude of that overall response. But it's basically underlying in one way, shape, or form. I think where people get caught up is that they bought into the idea that blood flow restriction is this magical tool, that they're going to be able to unlock new muscle growth. And I think that BFR resistance exercise is boring to me, because it's like, okay, we already know that it's going to produce similar growth. We already know that there's a moderator variable with pressure. We do know, as you said, and I firmly believe, if we apply too high a pressure, we're getting volitional fatigue before we get maximal motor unit stimulation, and thus potentially suboptimal results. That's boring. However, I do think that I'm very interested in this, is the potential synergistic effects that BFR has on aerobic exercise, and its potential to maximize the peripheral and or central stress that is given not only at low intensities, because we already know that that's going to happen, but at moderate to high intensities, where we're working at trying to create the maximum possible adaptation. And that's where the researchers out in Australia are trying to really understand, where I think BFR may have a novel impact beyond just low intensity exercise. But I just think that there's just like it with resistance exercise, people make it too complicated. You just train with it if you want to reduce your load. If you don't want to do BFR, then just do low load strength training to failure. You're going to do a lot more reps, but you're going to get many roads lead to growth.
Yeah, I will say that, we have some data coming out soon. I don't know if this is going to be repeatable. We're starting another study in January to try and address this, but, doing maximum hand grip exercise, right? That, like we said earlier, that induced the greatest amount of strength, but it did not induce a cross education effect. However, low intensity plus blood flow restriction did, which was surprising for me. Not that it wouldn't do it, but it would do it and high load wouldn't. And we had a non-exercise control, and we had about, I don't know, like 180 people in the study. So it's not like it's done on 7 people. So I feel pretty confident that there's something going on with the cross education effect. I don't know. I don't know what's driving it. Like, is there something special about just that hand grip modality that we wouldn't see it in doing dynamic exercise? I'm not sure. But yeah, I think that, in general, I'm in agreement that, blood flow restriction is a tool that could be used. It doesn't have to be used. There could be situations where maybe you do need to be using it, or if that's something that you really like to do, then just do that. But there could be some times we're doing rehabilitation, which is kind of your world, not mine. But seems like it could be effective to get you back to maybe normal exercise, or maybe there is something, some kinks in there with cross education or something like that, which I think is premature to say, but maybe something to keep an eye out on.
Yeah, I mean that is very interesting. We do see, and there is research out there, although I don't, in terms of some of the articles that were published that just show there is some growth that's happening and some strength increases that are happening on unoccluded areas, in the hips, for example. So I guess like that could be something that goes there. I mean, for me, I was always under the assumption that cross education is predominantly driven by intensity, of
Mine too.
contraction. So again, these are all things where if you have an overlying model, you fit in the nuance and you kind of see, all right, well, where does this potentially fit in? And if this is a novelty, that's great, because that helps us improve our overall understanding of the model that we're working with in our head. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. With that also being said, right, now shifting gears, right, you also were the first group to really, and this is segueing into my interests in this area, is you were really the first group to look at some of the differences between the cuff itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that as we have, as many people are going to be watching and listening, have used cuffs of different brands and everything, there is this idea that that in some marketing that all cuffs are created the same, or the effects are all similar. And I think I would love for you to touch upon some of your work in terms of cuff material and cuff width, which really those are the two that I associate you, your work with, in terms of building to where I'm at right now, where is more advanced features, design characteristics. But I really point to your lab in being the pioneers in this, sub niche of BFR, and also talking about how research is normally conducted and what devices are normally used for a lot of the research that you've done, and how that may or may not translate to the other devices that are commercially available.
Yeah. So I think how we came across this, when I first got to Oklahoma, they had a couple of different Katsu devices, and that was kind of probably the company that I guess made it very popular to begin with. So my initial bias, my initial go-to was, this is the way that blood flow restriction should be applied, right? I very much bought into the hype, right? This is how you do it, and anything else is not blood flow restriction. Now, the obvious issue with that is that looking at the literature, there were other people doing it that weren't doing the Katsu, but were seeing effects. So how I did those mental gymnastics in my mind, I'm not sure. I don't remember. But we first came to this going, well, when we apply the same pressure to everyone, it looks like some people have a very easy time and some people have a very tough time. So I wonder what accounts for that, right? I wonder what might play a role with that. And we first compared kind of the Hokanson wide cuff to the Katsu. And we were like, well, let's just compare these because people are using one pressure for one and using it with the other. And basically we found that the narrow cuff required a much greater pressure than the wide cuff. And in fact, a lot of them we couldn't even cut off, right? And that's something we can talk about here in a second too. But then we got to kind of discussing about, well, what if we had to be the same cuff size, right? And then we did that and we saw, much more similar effects, but people would say, well, there's still something about this cuff material, right? So when we would do all these comparisons, basically what we found is that a wide cuff requires a lower pressure, almost universally. The cuff material, it may matter a little bit, but as long as you're able to make the pressure relative, it's probably not that big of a deal. Now, I think the concern is that there's some of these cuffs where you can't make it relative, right? Because
and they still and sorry to cut you off, but this is like a huge area of pet peeve for me. And they continue to say our cuff is more comfortable and is giving you, because they can't apply the same relativized pressure, and they're saying, hey, we don't need arterial restriction, we just need venous restriction. That, okay, well, we're going to get the same result and you're going to be more comfortable. But none of the studies that I've come across have shown that when set to a standardized cuff length or cuff width, that when you relativize the pressure, that response is somehow different.
Yeah. Eventually I got to where I kind of transitioned to just using the Hokanson. It's just easier to apply. You know you have a better idea what the units mean. Because the Katsu also has something called the initial pressure, which is confusing for anyone who's never used the Katsu device. It's impossible to describe to someone. It just, to your other question, it's like a lot of the literature is using the Hokanson device, right? Which is what we use. We've used the Katsu. I have the Katsu, but I don't use it very often. Actually, I haven't used it in probably 10 years.
That's not very often.
But the Hokanson it's just easier. Now, Delphi came along and, they've been used successfully in studies as well. So I think the key thing is every cuff the same? No. But if you can somehow account for the pressure that you're applying, there's going to be minimal differences between them. Now, some people would suggest that in the lower body or even in the upper body, that if you apply a wide cuff, that maybe you attenuate some of the growth underneath the cuff. There's some data for that. Strength is not affected. You still see muscle growth, but maybe it's a little bit less. There's a couple studies that show that. However, and my bias is always a narrow cuff. There's something about it, the ease of use, it feels better, it's more comfortable. But in the lower body, it just doesn't work because for most people, the device can't cut off the blood flow. And so you can't
also
set a relative pressure.
And you also talked about in one of your papers that the muscle architecture may be something that we need to consider with respect to the upper versus the lower body. Because you did talk about one of your two papers where you're talking about participants actually preferred the narrower cuff in the upper body.
Yeah.
And I would totally agree with that. In fact, it's something that, like, if I have access, because I have access to a lot of different cuffs, I tend to use the narrow cuffs only for the upper body, just because we get the rolling of the bicep under the cuff, and it's uncomfortable.
The other thing I'll say is, this is something we've not published yet, but it was a good reminder for me about making sure I know exactly kind of what I'm measuring, because we find that, there is a little bit more discomfort when you apply blood flow restriction, right? And then I automatically make the parallel. Well, that means people aren't going to be, they aren't going to do it because it's more discomforting. But then when we ask people, it's like, would you
That's
continue
exactly.
doing this type of training? It's like, oh yeah. It's like,
Yep.
so it was more discomforting, but you would do it. You would still do it. Yeah. So I'm like, oh, why didn't I ever think about asking that simple question before?
We
So
did that. Yeah, we did that we have two studies that I was involved in looking at autoregulation, and we asked that question, the Likert scale, how likely are you to perform this exercise again? And we had the Delphi that was manufactured setting to do autoregulated versus non-autoregulated pressure, and then low load. And while autoregulation had no impact on the performance of, in the upper or lower body, it did have a little bit of divergent responses in the upper body versus the lower body, but no change in likelihood to perform it again across all different things. They were like, yeah, it was reported as more uncomfortable, but on, I think it was a 7 or 7.5 out of 10 in terms of likelihood to perform it. So it is something that is interesting, because from my practical experience on me, I am definitely somebody who's done all the BFR stuff that exists. Like, I've done all the protocols as much as I possibly can. And I hate every second of a lot of it. But talking about patients, like, there are patients that I've done BFR on once and like, I'm never doing that again. So it's interesting to see some of the dichotomy that exists within the likelihood to perform and
yep,
the actual, actually performing it, basically.
yep.
So yeah, so you commented on the cuff material so you're saying that it kind of doesn't really matter what material it is, especially if it's standardized to a relative same width and personalized pressure.
Yeah, I think the relative pressure accounts for a lot of things in my mind. The other point of that is what factors other than the cuff affect the pressure. Limb size, not that the composition doesn't matter, but it's mostly the size of the limb, at least from what I can tell, that on average, people with bigger limbs require greater pressures than people with smaller limbs. Obviously, if you're hypertensive, that's going to figure in there as well. But the point is, and I think this is something you've done really a good job on too, is just educating people that, yeah, all those things matter, but it seemingly you can account for a lot of them by just taking the relative pressure. And then we don't have to have this discussion.
Which is
Yeah,
unbelievable, because there was two papers that I was asked to review on different factors outside of the blood pressure or limb circumference, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but does that really matter? Because, this is almost like intellectual, like we're just doing things to do things to try to publish, because at the end of the day, if we're recommending personalized pressure, it's going to account for all of that.
yeah, yeah. The thing that we tried to do recently, we just put some revisions in. I had a former student, Dr. Rob Spitz, and this guy can build anything. So, and modify lots of different things. So I won't say how exactly we did this, but our idea would there be a way, because we can cut off blood flow on everyone with a wide cuff. It's a narrow cuff that we have a problem with. So this this guy basically is able to modify this device to where we can output very high pressures, much higher pressures than 300 millimeters of mercury. So the idea is let's get an equation where we'll apply a wide cuff, and then we'll just validate this equation. And then if people want to use narrow cuff, all they have to do is use the wide cuff and then put it in an equation and then apply that with this system with the narrow cuff. The issue is that we still had people we couldn't cut off. And the reason is because, on those narrow cuffs, the more narrow it becomes, the bladder length is still the same. So I think at some point you're covering such a small portion of the limb, because some of these people that we couldn't cut off, their limbs are enormous. So the cuff fits, but it's not really, it doesn't, like, the equation is kind of going to break down. So we weren't able to actually be successful in this. But I was excited at the time because he was showing me this device. Like, we applied a cuff to a paint can at first, and it like crumpled it. I'm like, okay, this might actually work. And we were able to get arterial occlusion on me, which I've never had before with a narrow cuff. But there's some people, and it's like, if we have like 10 people out of the study, it's like, well, then it's not useful.
Yeah.
We're going to run into the same problem. So I thought we had a way, but we didn't.
Well, you and your lab are going to continue to experiment, continue to push the field forward. Um, what I want to just talk about before we kind of wind down the podcast and turn it off is I want to just ask you, what has surprised you about blood flow restriction? What hasn't surprised you? And anything that you're looking forward to in the space in the years to come?
Yeah. What surprised me? It's a good question. I think one of the things is that I always thought about this from a muscle growth and strength perspective, as a kind of like a bodybuilder / powerlifter, things like that. And always had that as a view. Not that we always talked about it being useful for the clinical side, but I guess how much it's blown up in the clinics and how much it's blown up. I mean, even at Ole Miss, the football team, for rehabilitation uses it. They use it for all the athletes here. And I think that's at a lot of D1 universities in the United States. And I think, it's not, that's not from the stuff that I've done. It's stuff from what you've done, what Johnny Owens, people who go out in the space and talk to these people, clinicians, because that's who clinicians listen to. They're not going to listen to me. So I think
They should.
I think that, I think they should take the principles that we have and then use their clinical expertise to apply those how they see fit. But I have been surprised at how eventually receptive people have become, in a lot of places where I wouldn't necessarily expect that. I think the not surprising part, I'm not really sure. I guess one of the things that I think we're going to see more of as this gets applied more and more is these individual case studies, right? And they're usually going to be negative, right? Some of them are going to be positive, but some of them are going to be negative. That's not going to surprise me at all because I actually spoke in Denmark about blood flow restriction maybe 7 years ago. And one of the guys in the audience brought up the question of, what do you think? Basically asked me about the safety of blood flow restriction when you start applying this to a lot of people. And I understood this question, but I didn't really understand this question. I better understand this question now, right? But what I was getting at is I'm like, well, there's been safety studies that have been done that show that it's relatively safe. It's very comparable to normal exercise. But I think what he was getting at is when you take something and you apply it to lots of people, that's when you start to see some of the things that you only see in small groups of people. So that's where I think these case studies are going to be potentially useful, but also potentially maybe able to be used and say, see, I told you blood flow restriction is not safe, when they don't put it in context of what a case study is. But so I think that the number of case studies that are going to be coming out, I think it's not going to be surprising to me, but I would like to see it put into context of that study design. But I still think they can be useful because maybe overall, I think I feel comfortable saying that blood flow restriction is relatively safe and that it doesn't increase your risk compared to normal exercise for most people. But there's always that minority of populations that you're not going to see in a research study. And I think as this becomes more popular, we're going to find out who this works really, really well for. And then we're also going to find out, I think, hey, who this does not work well for and who it could be very, we need to be very careful. So I think we need to cautiously move forward. Um, but yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that, and I'm looking forward to. I don't have the ability to do this data. I'm not a clinician. I don't work in the clinical world, but I would like to see. I would like to have a better understanding of whether there's something to just applying blood filtration by itself, right? There's some studies early on to suggest that, hey, maybe there's something to this. That's kind of my first phase of my progression model. If you can't do anything else, do this inflation and deflation. Maybe that can attenuate muscle loss. Maybe it can help maintain strength. But there's not a whole lot of data behind that. And I don't know why that is. Is it because other studies have been done and don't show it, so they don't publish it? Is it because they're just really tough to do those studies? But I would like to see that done in clinical settings with a bigger population, bigger sample size. That's on my wish list. But beyond that, I think just continuing on and with our progression of research is what I'm excited about.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely so many interesting questions that are asked or are being asked by various cohorts. I haven't really thought about the case study scenario before, but it really makes a lot of sense because the biggest thing that I get asked is, I have this patient. Can I do BFR on that person? And I do my best to not get frustrated because I know people want an answer. But for us as clinicians, and I always go thinking back to, okay, what is the indications for BFR in the clinical setting, right? We have disuse atrophy, we have a loss of muscle mass, we have a loss of muscle strength, we have a decrease in function, we have a decrease in aerobic capacity. Can this approach impact any of those aforementioned impairments? If it can, then it is indicated. That's the first step. Then the second step is involving some sort of screening process, right? And it's something that is super interesting to me because when you're talking about the fact that, of course, there's going to be people that are going to be intolerant to BFR. We see it on a day-to-day. We try to use, and the way that I try to teach BFR is, for me, I firmly believe that and we're seeing the adaptations that happen in strenuous resistance exercise at the microvascular level and at the muscle cell level in terms of ion channel differences and things like that to help maintain and buffer the metabolites to help with sustaining performance. We see that they're very similar with strenuous exercise and supersede low intensity exercise. So it goes back to one of my biggest and most important screening questions is, have they done resistance exercise before? What is their history? Because we know these adaptations with a repeated bout effect can last a long time, right? So for us, it's more like, how strenuous have they exercised in the last 6 months, right? And using that as a kind of screener, but we're inevitably going to get these populations that are going to be intolerant to BFR. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that we have to look at it in the totality of the evidence and what that person is presenting with to be able to make a firm conclusion. It goes back to that case study that was published where somebody was just recovering from a flu and decided that he wanted to do a full body BFR session and then had a reaction and then continued to exercise and then presented next day in the emergency room with rhabdo.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, it's all about taking these things into context. And I definitely am interested in that cell swelling aspect because, but I will say from a clinician perspective, right, that I don't necessarily know how many clinical scenarios that would actually be relevant for. Because a lot of times, not all, you're going to have individuals that are cleared to do some sort of isometric, right? Whether they're booted, Like there was a recent study that, they were booted. This is the beginning of it, but Larson in 2 years ago was doing booted ankles and doing leg extensions and was well tolerated, didn't impact bone healing, etc. But there's very few situations where I would be like, we're going to completely go passive and not have you do anything. So I think that question to me is more of a mechanistic question. Does cell swelling have the capacity to, if in my model it's mechanical tension driven, does the process of cell swelling increase mechanical tension without active muscle contraction? And there was a paper that was published in 2019 that, as I was preparing my on-demand course, shameless plug, www.bfrtraining.com, that looked at the role of cell swelling and its impact on mechanical tension. And they were showing that cell swelling augments mechanical tension, transverse pressure at the muscle fiber level at longer lengths, but has no impact on shorter lengths. So my question would be, if this is, mechanical tension is a driver, couldn't we do a control group that does nothing, cell swelling in the knee flex position if we're looking at the quads, and cell swelling in the extended position if we're looking at the quads, and seeing if there's any sort of preservation effect?
Yeah. I think the other thing that this kind of stimulated this thought, this is something, and I don't know, it's just something I've been thinking about. Because what you said earlier, kind of with some of the people who are saying we're only causing venous restriction, and that's going to be what's driving this response. I think I would say that I don't think we know why applying the cuff does anything, right? So for me, I've been kind of curious as to, is it related to how much blood flow is being reduced? Is it related to what happens from that? Or is it that plus or due to the pressure itself? Like, is there something about sensing pressure being applied to your limb? Or is it a combination of that plus, I don't know. But I've been curious about that, where it's like, when we apply a cuff, we have these things happen. Is that why we see these effects? Or, I mean, because it's hard to apply a cuff and not see those. So it's hard to address that in a human. But I'm like, or is there something about just applying pressure, and then you know that pressure is being applied to your limb? Does that in and of itself do something? I don't know.
But that goes to, if you had the statistical power to be able to do this, what I would do is you'd have, and again, very high sample size you're going to need, but you'd have a regular doing a low load exercise, right? Then you'd have a sham 20 to 30 millimeters of mercury applied, and then you'd have a personalized pressure, right? So at least you're able to then see, is there any sort of difference, and then moderating, whatever outcome variables you're looking at, which again, that goes to, if we do need a sham, right, in that type of design, to be able to say, is there a role of actual just pressure? And then my mind goes to, well, what is the minimum pressure that we need? It's the same as the volume. It's what is the minimum pressure that we need to meaningfully accelerate the fatiguing processes that are occurring at the muscle level to be able to maximize the therapeutic gains in muscle mass, muscle size? May or may not be different than the vascular adaptations. Or for me, I also think that there's a potentially a greater role for higher amounts of applied pressure if we're talking about exercise-induced analgesia. But yeah, like, these are all the kind of thought-provoking questions that, and part of the reason why I'm having this conversation is just to kind of stew over as we're trying to just understand more about this, this mode of exercise.
Yeah. And one of the things that we're trying to do too is coming up with ways where we move people away from failure, right? And then see how low can we go, and like where we start to really see the effects of BFR. So I think we have some interesting data on that. Method's not perfect, but I think that, one of the things I wanted to really test was, I got very used to saying you get the same adaptations, but you do less repetitions, right? And that was true. But it's also assuming that if this group doing more repetitions were to do less, that they wouldn't see the same adaptation. So we've started to kind of move to testing that, and we do find that, yeah, when you start reducing this, depending on the variable you're looking at, blood flow restriction is having an effect, which was good for me. I'm like, okay, I haven't lost my mind. But I think that's something that we've been kind of experimenting with too. Kind of same point. What's the least that we can do here, and move people away from failure, and apply blood flow restriction and compare it to people doing the same reps without it, because that's how you can test the effects of blood flow restriction. And it's really hard to set up study designs with blood flow restriction because you don't know when people are failing. So people are doing different proximities to failure, which is problematic.
And to piggyback off this, and then we'll close off the podcast. So exactly that question that you just asked, I'm interested in, because in the clinical setting, we are educated according to the guidelines. You were on this paper, the Patterson et al. Paper that's well cited, and the Alexandro paper, just showing that muscle mass and muscle strength tend to be, or muscle mass tends to be similar with BFR, muscle strength tends to be a little bit less than heavy load strength training. But for me, I am very focused on the perceptual demands of discomfort that's experienced, because myself, my patients, or whatever. So I'm always looking for the minimum effective dose. So we actually have a paper that's in review right now, but we published it as a preprint, which meta-analyzed, I think we had 24 studies. And what we looked at is, does the repetition scheme matter when we apply blood flow restriction compared to the heavy load strength training group? And what we found was that the repetition scheme apparently doesn't really matter with whatever comparator that they're using. Now, again, it's not volume load matched. It was literally pure ecological validity of, they decided to do, we separated into 3 different groups: the traditional failure repetition schemes, the 30, 15, 15, 15, and 3 to 4 sets of 15. So multiple sets of 15. And we just meta-analyzed whatever their heavy load strength training comparator was. We found no difference. So it looks like the barometer for volume, at least within our data set there, we probably only need 3 to 4 sets of 15 repetitions in order to get the same relative response in muscle growth of heavy load strength training. So like, kind of what you were literally just saying, like, I've kind of been thinking about this as well, because 75 reps is a lot of repetitions. And when we think about translating something from the laboratory setting to a practical setting, I'm not having my patients do 75 reps of anything, much less adding blood flow restriction to them. But I have had my patients do 3 sets of 15. I have had my patients do 4 sets of 15, depending on the exercise. So this is now kind of shaping my own beliefs about the potential role of volume in even doing things like blood flow restriction. So, but interesting enough, just to cap off the last thing, we then subgrouped it according to the upper body and lower body, and it turns out that we have much less comparisons in the upper body than the lower body, but it turns out that the upper body favored heavy load strength training in terms of muscle growth, but the lower body really didn't. And we don't know if that's a byproduct of the amount of studies that were just involved or not, or an actual effect. But it does go to kind of mirror and to be frank, bring our conversation full circle of what we were talking about before, which is, what is the minimum effective volume that we need to have in order to gain a significant training effect and get people exercising and get people moving.
Yeah.
So is there any last thoughts, comments that you have on what you kind of touched upon what your lab is doing in the future? Literally, this is just the last little bit for you to give shout outs, whatever you have, where people can contact you. And whatnot.
Yeah, you can contact me on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram at JP Loenneke, Loenneke. I'm not very good at Instagram. Twitter, I'm better at, but I've kind of moved. I don't spend as much time on there over the past few years as it's kind of turned into the wild, wild west at certain points. Um, I'm either misremembering what it used to be like when I was in grad school, or like it could just be that I'm misremembering it, or I thought it was much better than it was. But it does feel different than it used to. But I still find that to be a useful avenue, and you can contact me on there. If you don't care about blood flow restriction, please, you don't have to tell me. You can just not care about it. But yeah, I always like to thank my students. I've been so fortunate my entire time here to have really good students who are very curious, who work really, really, really hard all the time. And that's still the same thing to right now. So, and yeah, if you don't have that culture, if you don't have a good team around you, you're going to be really limited on what you can do as a professor. So I've been very fortunate to be able to keep bringing in good people who add to the culture. I think that all of the props go to them for sure. But yeah, beyond that, any closing things? I just think blood flow restriction, there's always going to be some risk involved. The question is not whether there's a risk, whether it increases the risk compared to something else. And for most people, it doesn't appear to do that. I think low loads, high loads both induce growth to a point. Obviously, if you go low enough, that they won't. But the loads that most people use is going to be very similar. Strength is best increased by lifting heavy weights. And whether or not that strength is driven by muscle growth, I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. And there could be lots of reasons for that, but the evidence doesn't exist. So why do people get stronger with blood flow restriction? I don't know. I used to think it was muscle growth. I don't think that anymore. At least not in the 6 to 8, 12-week studies that are done. But there's no evidence that it plays a role beyond that, even though that's what people will select. Well, at 2 years, yeah, maybe at 2 years. I don't know. You're right. We don't know. But the evidence that people always draw from is on the 8-week studies, which, doesn't appear to support that. But beyond that, those are always my main takeaways. I'll also close with this. I thought about this. One of my former students she actually moved away from kind of human data. She's really interested in cancer cachexia. That's Dr. Brittany Counts. One of the things that she brought up last year, because, we have a tendency, I won't throw you in here. I'll just talk about myself, is you only focus on the variables that you discuss, right? So I'll be like, volume is not that important for these adaptations. And one of the comments that she brought up at one of our conferences last year was, what adaptations, right? What are you measuring? She goes, and she wasn't coming off as aggressively as I am telling the story, but it's like, you're talking about muscle growth and you're talking about strength, but there's lots of other things going on that you didn't measure. And I think our point still stands, especially if you're doing 3 to 4 sets. But it's still a good lesson for me, because I was like, oh, that's a good point, right? There could be something where pressure does matter, or there could be something where volume does matter. But for muscle growth and strength, probably not. But I think that was a good lesson for me to hear that.
Well, listen, this has been an amazing over 2 hours now. So if you're still watching this or listening to this, we did try to plan on going 90 minutes, but there's just so much to talk about. And we still didn't even hit on so many different areas. But again, just wanted to say thank you again for your time, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. And yeah, hope to speak soon. You're always welcome back on the podcast to talk more about your work and the space. And yeah, that's an episode, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And that was today's episode of the BFR Better for Results podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, I would love if you subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're watching or listening on. I really appreciate the support.